Getting ahead in business isn't all about introducing new products and new services. It's also about how you manage risk. Now, that's according to some research by two INSEAD professors who join us today on INSEAD Knowledge. They're professors Serguei Netessine and Karan Girotra. Thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it. Your research was published recently in the Harvard Business Review, and the title of the article was How to Build Risk into Your Business Model. Don't most business people build risk into their business model already?
I think business models come inherent with some risks in them. I think what we are advocating is how your business model deals with those risks. That can be a way of differentiating yourself from the competition.
Sergei, what are some of the concrete examples of risks? What makes your theory different?
Risks can take various shapes or forms. I think the most natural ones that everyone can think of is risk of demand. So what will consumers demand tomorrow? How will their preferences change? And everybody knows that those kinds of preferences evolve very quickly over time. And so what is demanded in fashion today is not demanded tomorrow. Another risk could be technological risk. So for example, the technology that is core of our computers today is not going to be the same tomorrow, and so on and so forth. So risks can come from demand side. They can also come from supply side.
Can we give a specific example? You used the example of Zara.
Right. So the predominant logic in apparel industry nowadays, before Zara anyway, was that it's producing clothing is a labor-intensive process. So this can be best done by outsourcing those processes to countries with low labor costs. So most of brand name manufacturers of apparel have moved their production to China, India, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Bangladesh, etc., etc. Now, what they did not probably think about very carefully is increasing their risk exposure when they are doing so, because suddenly they have to think very, very far in advance about what to produce, how much to produce, where to produce. And then once this decision has been made, it's very hard to reverse it because it takes time to deliver goods. All your suppliers require some time to ramp up capacity, to start production, purchase components, etc. And Zara turned this business model upside down completely and said, look, you might actually do better by minimizing your risk in predicting demand a year in advance, and doing this very, very quick cycle of production, which is with production facilities located in Spain. And as a result, you are only a few 100 kilometers away from your end customers. You learn about your demand, you learn about what is hot now, and you produce it quickly, and you turn out a new collection or new product every 2 to 4 weeks maybe, and customers come to a store and they see something new every time, versus the predominant logic in this industry has been there is 1-2 collections per year, and you come once, you look at what you want to buy, then you come 6 months later, you see it on sales and you buy it.
Let me just be devil's advocate for a minute, because this is all, they're making their money on the distribution. They're not taking the big risk, which was coming up with the new design, the new look, the new fashion. They're going out copying that, so they know it's popular. They go back and they manufacture it quickly in Galicia, and then they turn it over. Part of me thinks that's a little bit not creative and a little bit sneaky, or am I wrong there? Or where's the creativity in here? You're creating what with this?
I think there's different kinds of creativity. There's creativity in coming up with new products, which is definitely valuable. At the same time, there's creativity in coming up with new business models. I think our recommendation would not be like Zara, that is not be creative on products. Some would argue they are creative, but even if we go with the logic that they're not creative, I think our argument would be that these things are not either or. You can be creative on both. You can invent new products and create very interesting new technologies, new products, but to really realize the value from them, to really protect yourself from being copied, I think it's important to also organize and create the right business models around that. I think an example we've discussed often of a company which has really done all steps of this process well is a company like Apple. So I think Perhaps they've innovated in some sense on technologies, but innovated a lot on products. We can think of the iPod or the iPhone. So definitely very creative in designing products that customers want. But I think to really realize the full value out of this, the iPhone or the iPod, I think they created the business model which involved this ecosystem around Apple product.
You know, even emerging economies, I like to use my home country, Russia, as an example, where there's a big push from the president to reinvigorate, innovate the economy. But somehow all of those discussions focus just on technological innovation and more specifically on nanotechnologies. And there are huge amounts of money allocated by the government to achieve breakthroughs in nanotechnology. And you know, maybe that's a great thing, maybe something will be achieved, but my concern is that, for example, most of Russian economy just has nothing to do with nanotechnologies. It's mostly oil and gas, right? So what can nanotechnology reasonably do for oil and gas industry? Well, I would argue much less than business model innovation, because existing business models in those industries in Russia are very inefficient. So, and second question, how much money we're going to spend on this nanotechnologies before we see any outcome? I mean, if experience is any indication, it typically takes 10, 15, 20 years to commercialize something like this, right? While with business models, I would argue you don't spend that much money on innovation, and at the same time, you see the result much, much faster.
So I think business model innovation, while can be an important strategy to keep reinvigorate developed economies, I think it's almost necessary often to even innovate the business model when you're going into a market with very different characteristics. So I think this is relevant for everyone, and not just either in the developed world or any place. Both places, I think it presents a lot of opportunity to realize advantages.
Give me a couple of concrete, a little checklist for a businessman or woman out there that he or she might want to look in his business model to see what kind of innovation might be there that they could do. Let's just assume that they've listened to this interview, they're ready to go. What's their checklist?
I think the step number one is just to try to look at your entire value chain, which is not just your company, but also your buyers and your suppliers, and brainstorm about what kind of risks are involved in this value chain. Because in my experience, companies do this very, very rarely. So, you know, they focus much more on, say, just reducing costs rather than thinking about, okay, what kind of risk comes with this cost reduction, right? And then I would say that would be the very, very first fundamental basic step. Once you identified the major sources of risk, then you can start thinking about innovating your business model around those risks.
Right. And we have in the article more details about specific techniques which are about innovating on these risks. These could involve reducing the risk by getting more information in some fashion, by sharing the risk with others, by diversifying away different risks. So there's a host of techniques. Once you've identified the sources, I think then there's a toolkit which can help you really either reduce, hedge it, diversify it away, or share away the risk so as to reduce the consequences of the risk on your bottom line.
Yeah. And I would say what's probably a counterintuitive part of our article is that risk is not always a bad thing. What you might want to do, you might actually want to take more risk upon yourself. And that's something that, again, in my experience, few managers think about. So, you know, examples like we gave in the article, Rolls-Royce saying, look, you know, airline customers, you are taking a big risk in figuring out how much repair of the engine is going to cost you. No more. We're going to take this risk upon ourselves. You just pay for flying hours. And that takes away all risks from airlines and gives all risks to Rolls-Royce. But then you might be able to charge more if this is something that your customers want.
And I think the core of that counterintuitive point is what Sergei said before. You need to look at the risks in your value chain. So I think the example that Sergei gave was you took on some of the risk that your customers had. You took it on to yourself, but you're better at managing this risk. So the customer is willing to pay you
so
for
he doesn't have to worry about it.
He doesn't have to worry about it. So it is not always about reducing risk, it's about analyzing the risks in the whole value chain and coming up with, in some sense, a better distribution or allocation of the risk, which can perhaps make everyone better off.
Well, I want to thank you both, Karan and Sergei, for being with us here on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.